After 18 years as the longest-serving Senate leader ever, Mitch McConnell is starting the year as a backbencher. At 82, he's thinking about his legacy. He recently cooperated on a book about his life, relinquishing his personal papers to the biographer. After voting against Pete Hegseth for Defense Secretary, the question is, how much more will McConnell defy President Donald Trump? Everybody wants to know, what will Mitch do?
The story will continue in a moment.
You have said that you feel liberated, like Martin Luther King, free at last.
Yeah,
So,
well, I
free for what? Free to do what?
well, I will be more outspoken about things that I particularly care about than I have been in the past.
Particularly the resurgence of isolationism in today's Republican Party.
America first, that's what they used in the 30s. And I'm hopeful the new administration will understand and act, not with just language that says America first, but funding that underscores the nature of the threat. Look, what is the situation? North Korea, China, Russia, Iran. This is a huge threat, a fight between the autocrats and the democracies. And when it comes to the democratic world, only one country can lead, that's us.
That's fundamental to the difference between what you're saying and what this administration seems to be saying, which is we don't want to be the leader of the free world anymore.
Well, I can only speak for myself. I think it's dangerous to step aside and assume that by speaking to autocrats, they will somehow treat you better.
What about tariffs against our allies?
It will drive the cost of everything up. In other words, it'll be paid for by American consumers. I mean, why would you want to get in a fight with your allies over this?
What about the encroachment on the independence of the Senate, for example? Will you be speaking out about that?
I sure will. When I was majority leader and he was president, he tried to get me to change the filibuster.
Right.
I said I had a one-word answer, no.
In the book, it says that you had a couple of screaming matches on the phone with the president.
We had a candid relationship, you know.
The Trump-McConnell feud has been roiling for a long time.
We do have to do something about Mitch McConnell. He's a disaster. He's a disaster.
President Trump called you, among other things, a sullen, unsmiling political hack. You have said some pretty harsh things about him. You've said he's nasty. You said he's not very smart. You said he's a sleazeball.
Well, those were private comments, and
Well, but they're in your biography.
yeah.
He vented about Donald Trump to his biographer, Michael Tackett, who interviewed him over the last 3 years. What's the most courageous thing he did as leader?
The most courageous thing he did as leader was stand up for aid for Ukraine. It wasn't popular within his party. It wasn't popular with Donald Trump. It wasn't popular with J.D. Vance, but he did it anyway.
What's the most despicable thing he did?
The most contentious thing he did was to block Merrick Garland, not simply from getting a vote in the Senate, but from even having a hearing in the Senate.
McConnell single-handedly blocked President Obama's nomination of Merrick Garland to the Supreme Court.
One of my proudest moments is when I looked at Barack Obama in the eye and I said, Mr. President, you will not fill this Supreme Court vacancy.
This was the first step in McConnell's engineering of a conservative supermajority on the Supreme Court. What about the way you went about imposing these justices into the system? How do you feel as you look back on your legacy?
I feel fine about it. I knew that if the shoe was on the other foot,
But is that a good reason?
they would have done the same thing.
Your biographer, and I'm quoting him, said it was a brutish exercise of power. Brutish.
I just don't agree.
I know, but what do you think about that sort of image of you?
I decided political Popularity was not my motivation. I was going to try to help right of center America have a voice, and that was what I thought was the most important thing I could do.
Do you take any responsibility that the court has lost so much credibility? There's been a recent poll that says 70% of the American people think that justices are more influenced by ideology than by being fair and impartial.
Yeah. The reason their popularity is down is because the Democrats are criticizing them all the time.
Okay, but I'm not talking about popularity. I'm talking about credibility of a major institution.
But Lesley, their job is not to seek public approval. It's to follow the law.
So this is your beloved Senate. How do you feel about the Senate?
Glad to be in the majority.
At 82, he has slowed down, looks frail. There have been questions about his health ever since he froze at the microphones in the Capitol over a year ago. He told us the freeze was caused by a concussion that he suffered from a fall. 7 months later,
This will be my last term as Republican leader of the Senate.
when he was leader, his trademark was inscrutability.
Any comments, Leader McConnell? How do you feel today went?
I'm not going to answer questions about when.
He earned the nickname Darth Vader.
I'm suggesting that I'm not going to answer your question. I want to control the message if I can.
Are you doing that right now?
Yeah.
McConnell's has been a long and improbable journey. Born in 1942 in rural Alabama, he was stricken with polio at age 2. His mother drove him to Warm Springs, Georgia, to the polio facility established by Franklin Roosevelt. The treatment? He wasn't allowed to walk for 2 years.
I was lucky to have a mother who was absolutely determined to do everything she could to get me back to normal.
They moved to Louisville, Kentucky, and when Mitch was in high school, he found his niche in student government. So he'd been developing his political skills and acumen from the youngest age.
He was almost born 40 years old in a suit. I mean, he wanted to be in politics.
McConnell mastered the inside game over his 40 years in the Senate, so much so that Tackett says he's the most impactful Senate leader since Lyndon Johnson.
You can draw a straight line from what he did to shape the courts to the overturning of Roe versus Wade, to the overturning of affirmative action. By changing the court, changing the composition of the court, he changed American life.
But his job became more difficult as his party became more MAGA, and even worse after President Trump used a racial slur against his second wife, Elaine Chao. Did you ever confront him about what he said about your wife, Elaine?
No, I chose not to engage with him.
And today? You feel okay about that?
No, I don't feel okay about it.
How would you describe your relationship with President Trump?
Well, we haven't spoken for quite a while. I was very upset about what happened January 6th.
You had to be evacuated from the Senate along with other leaders. Your staff was in your office. The rioters were banging on your door. Someone with a flagpole broke a window into your office.
Well, my staff in the Capitol was putting furniture up against the doors
To prevent them from
to
coming
prevent the rioters from outside from breaking the doors and getting at them. And what was it about? To try to prevent the orderly transfer of government, which had never happened in our country.
Your staff, after the crisis was over, you went and spoke with them. It was a highly emotional situation. You remember?
Oh, I remember well.
Do you remember what you told them?
That, yeah, I remember what I told them.
That emotion turned to fury.
President Trump is practically and morally responsible for provoking the events of the day. That's the way I still feel about it.
What are your views on President Trump and his supporters trying to change what happened on January 6th? They're calling it a day of love. They call the rioters martyrs.
Yeah, no, it was an insurrection.
What about the pardons for the people who stormed the Capitol that day?
I think pardoning people who've been convicted is a mistake.
But while he has been critical of the president, he has almost always wound up retracting his clause. Take the impeachment battle.
The question is on the article of impeachment.
McConnell ended up voting against convicting Mr. Trump at the Senate trial that took place after he had just left office. A conviction could have disqualified the ex-president from running for re-election.
McConnell thought that the criminal and civil justice system would be there to hold Trump to account for his actions. And as we know, it didn't happen.
And partly because of him.
The court he created ended up being the court that helped to enable Donald Trump to not eventually face prosecution. It was the biggest miscalculation of his political career, and no doubt will be a stain on his legacy.
So now Donald Trump is president again, issuing an onslaught of executive orders and controversial nominees for his cabinet.
Pete Hegseth.
McConnell was one of only 3 Republicans who voted against Pete Hegseth for defense secretary. And while he won't tip his hand on how he'll vote on the others,
I don't have any news to make on that front.
he did signal some reluctance about the nominee who would oversee the nation's health care system. You're a polio survivor. There is one of the cabinet nominees, RFK Jr., who says that the polio vaccine killed more people than polio. What are your views about that?
Well, the polio vaccine, it's been a huge success.
But what about all of them? Measles, mumps, chicken pox?
Oh, vaccines are critically important to health, to having normal lives.
How important is that issue to you? You know, we're talking about things you would fight for. You're free at last. You're free to speak your mind.
Well, it's no surprise that it's a big deal with me.
So what will Mitch do now? Will he lead an opposition to the head of his party? Not likely.
I expect to support most of what this administration is trying to accomplish. So what happened in the past is irrelevant to me.
You said that January 6th was evidence of Donald Trump's complete unfitness for office.
I said shortly after January 6th that if he were the nominee for president, I would support him.
Even if he's unfit for office?
I'm a Republican. I don't get to decide who gets to be president. The American people do. And you have to admit, they did. And he's back.
Senator McConnell's engineering of the Supreme Court.
He tells his staff, find us some justification for this argument.
At 60minutesovertime.com.
Do this when the White House